Hello and welcome back, and today we want to take a comparatively quick look at this. This is the Minisforum G7 Pro. It's a device we've actually talked about a couple of times on the channel when it's been in the background of trade shows, and to be perfectly frank with you, I wasn't giving it personally that much attention. For those that have seen the way we talk about Minisforum here on the channel, you'll know that more often than not, unless one of their solutions can be turned into a NAS, I generally kind of get turned off by it relatively quickly. I care more about running these things in TrueNAS and Unraid, or running them in Proxmox, and can you tell I've got a sore throat? However, Minisforum sent this to me and I was on the verge of sending it back until I started looking into just what this thing is, and ultimately I want to see why this exists more than anything, because I think a lot of people that are looking at this right now, even here on the desk, and thinking, oh, it's pretty small, and hearing about the specifications that we'll cover in a moment, a lot of you are going to wonder, why on earth would you buy this when you could just buy one of these? This, for the uninitiated, is called a laptop. It is a device that is an alternative in terms of portability to a desktop computer. Now, this runs on an Intel 13th generation i7. It also arrives with an RTX 4050. Now, this knocked me back, I reckon, about $1,000 a couple of years ago. I think I got this. This device here on my right, this runs on an Intel 14th generation i9. In fact, if we're going to get into the weeds, it's a 24-core, 32-thread processor that can be clocked up to 5.8 gigahertz. Alongside that, a smaller form factor NVIDIA RTX 5070, arriving with 8 gigabytes of GDDR7, with that graphics card running on a 5x8 lane. This paired with a couple of SODIMM slots there, supporting up to DDR5 non-ECC up to 5200 megahertz speed, 96 gigabytes max, and a couple of M.2s inside at 5x4 and 4x4. The internal hardware here is pretty bloody impressive. But even then, looking at those specs, if you compare that to a laptop, which remember will arrive with a monitor, in fact a full KVM experience with the keyboard and touchpad and a battery inside, we look at the pricing that this device is arriving at, currently on offer, well, in-house offer at $1,359 from a reported RRP of $1,699. That price sits somewhere in the middle of relatively similar specifications in Intel processor, the Intel Core in 3, 5, 7 and 9, alongside laptops that arrive with a similar RTX 5070, and again pricing there starting around $1,200 to $1,300 and even getting as high as a couple of grand. So in some arguments, you are getting quite a reasonable amount of hardware for the price, but it's still no laptop. And classing itself as a mini PC, I find baffling, particularly for a Minisforum, who recently have had some absolutely cracking mini PCs. But I think no one is going to call this PS5-like system a mini PC, only in the boundaries of comparing it against absolutely banging and over-imposing desktop computer chassis would ever call this a mini PC. Also, on a side note, a lot of people that are talking about this already have named that price of $1,300 on offer down from $1,600. It is worth highlighting, and I've weirdly seen a few places not touch on this, that doesn't include an OS SSD or the RAM, which we both know right now at the start of 2026 is absolutely swelteringly expensive right now. You can get it as a bundle with that on Minisforum's site, and that clocks the price up to around $1,600, but still, if you compare that against a laptop which will almost certainly arrive with an OS SSD and a RAM when you buy it new retail, means this device is never going to stop being compared unfavourably against laptops. But let's talk about it as a PC, but more predominantly its design and its deployment as a gaming rig. Firstly, in terms of design, hats off to your Minisforum. This thing is easy on the friggin' eyes. I will say it arrives with a removable base panel. That removable base panel you do screw in. I didn't screw it in just to make this part of the video a lot easier, but that is a nice hefty metal base that it sits on top of. It's not going to get knocked over unless you seriously want to give it a kick, but I will say the external is plastic, and by the way, a bit of a bugger to get off. There are 3 screws at the base of the system that you unscrew. And once you've done that, you've kind of got to clack the panel off. It doesn't smoothly come off there. Something which I would give that as a compliment in the past to a lot of Minisforum systems where they've really thought about removing and accessing for troubleshooting and maintenance. This does a much poorer job there. And also those plastic panels, although they did not appear to be any kind of problem in terms of thermals during my testing, more on that later, I will say I'm kind of surprised that metal wasn't considered on this, if not from an aesthetic point of view, but maybe from a dissipation point of view. When you're cramming in all of these components, it takes advantage of 2 turbo fans inside for the GPU, CPU, as well as 6 copper heat pipes running all the way through the device. Inside, you've got the 2 M2s with room for a standard M.2 heatsink there on board, not a surrounding one, just one where it goes on top, and that's included with the kit alongside a Wi-Fi 6 card with the antenna neatly tucked in around the edges there. But I will say, much like a laptop, this thing's chunky PSU is going to put some people off. Obviously, a system at this scale, the odds of it having an internal PSU are always going to be pretty slim, but a 250 watt brick like this, well, it was expected, but the one thing I didn't expect, I'll crack it round to the rear, is the odd placement of the power connector. That barrel connector you can see there at the top. I understand probably from a build point of view, that's where it needs to be to feed in to the GPU, CPU setup. But having that on top of the USB 4 port, the HDMI output, and the network port, 2.5G by the way, is kind of weird, and I really don't like that. And it's not even an angled barrel. They didn't go for an angled barrel, it's sticking straight out there. And yes, there isn't a lot of room for an angled barrel though, but I do think aesthetically there hopefully would have been a better way to do it, maybe with the PSU a little bit lower where other cables are not going to be in the way, or at least an angle guide there for that PSU. Port and connectivity is fantastic. We've got USB 4, we've got SD card slots there, we've got USB-C and A all over the gaff, and as mentioned, a 2.5 gig NIC. Again, hence why this is a NAS, maybe for something like Proxmox and VM deployment it's more desirable, but a single 2.5 gig NIC, no PCIe upgrade to speak of. But I like the design. Also, you've got RGB control across the top, but more importantly, you've got this turbo button, which you can utilize when the system's operating. Again, it arrives with Windows. This is the system Minisforum supplied. They're not paying for this video. They're seeing it at the same time as you are. But it arrives with this turbo button that you can switch between work mode and gaming mode there. Now, I don't know what that does in terms of clocking speed. I couldn't see much in the BIOS to denote that it was ramping things up in terms of overclocking or anything like that, but it certainly ramps up a lot of the cooling. I hate seagulls. But you can't talk cooling without talking about noise. If you can have a couple of fans inside there and this device being so terribly compact, what about the old eardrums? How are they going to do? Because realistically, this is going to be deployed for a lot of users as a gaming system in the void, in the gap of a console you'd use at home for like a PlayStation or an Xbox. I can see a lot of people deploying this just behind or next to the TV with gaming in mind from the sofa. This is a PC console to a man, and I would say right now, the cost of the Steam machine being reported early doors, this might be desirable for some if you spend a little bit more, just for how much more you get. But for the noise, let's go through a couple of different operational environments. When I had the system set to work mode and I had the system idle, just waiting to do stuff, so this is going to effectively be the day-to-day operation when it's just there, it only went up to 33 to 35 dBA, which really, really surprised me. Now, what about when we had the fans on active? I ramped the fans up with the gaming mode and had the system pretty much prepped and good to go, and that was when the fans only hit around 42 to 44 dBA. I'm not going to call that quiet, Lord no, but I'm going to say for this amount of hardware inside, and I compared the noise of that against the laptop that I use every day, I was actually kind of impressed when I've had some NAS solutions here on the table, a couple of fans that have cracked well into the 50 dBA. So again, respect to the noise management, even with a couple of turbo fans. But how did that translate into temps? We had our thermal imaging camera out and we wanted to test this system. Now, we've had it on and off for the better part of a week here. I say we, me and Eddie here at NAScompares. But on top of that, I did a 4-hour constant gaming session on this. I flicked between 4 different games, Street Fighter 6, Sons of the Forest, Sonic Racing, and Resident Evil 4. And I would say temps-wise after that 4 hours of gaming were again pretty good. I did have it on gaming mode with the fans on, but on the side of the system where the GPU is with that ventilated panel, I saw temperatures of only around 45 degrees. As you can make out though, it's the base of the system where it meets that kind of stand, where it was hitting around 50 degrees at the base there. I do think that vent is ever so slightly blocked by the stand holding this up, and maybe a slight bit of elevation or venting and angling and chambering of that heat may have dropped that just a tiniest bit. Not terrible, but it's worth keeping that in mind. On the non-GPU side, or at least the non-fans GPU side, temps are only around 33 to 34. Now, when we look at the front of the system, we saw temps of around 32 to 35 around the front mounted panels. But all the ventilated chambers, the airflow captured chambers, for the CPU and GPU, carrying out all of the air over that, piping out the tops, we saw some of those vents hitting 47 to 48. And on the rear of the system, we saw around the main ports connections that were doing the work, the PSU input there alongside the network port and the USBs, of around 50 degrees. So again, temperatures all the way around the device. They weren't like fridge or nothing, but they weren't cooking eggs either. And I'd say for 4 hours of consistent gaming on this, those are pretty respectable numbers. And temps that when we used to do testing on the PlayStation 5, when we were bench testing a lot of the SSDs and core system temps, a couple of years ago here on the channel, I saw numbers much higher than that for that system. So again, fair play for a system being significantly more powerful and hardware rich, hitting such respectable temps in that test at least. Now, power consumption is a little bit more complicated because it's going to come down to not only using artificial benchmarks and actual real-time gaming, but on top of that, everyone's setup is going to be different there. And also every single game, every parameter you use. So unfortunately, benchmarking is also the way to go. First up was getting a bench there for the idle. The system not doing much. That test we mentioned earlier on, we were looking at the noise. I'm pleased to say that when the system was in work mode and idle, I was really surprised. It went down as low as 22 to 25 watts. Again, some of the more modern Intel CPUs do a very good job of bringing down their base TDP very well during idle periods, and this is a great example of that with the GPU doing sweet FA. It wasn't even warming up or anything like that. Now, when we went into the full CPU testing, we were using PCMark's specific CPU test with max multi-thread. That's all of the threads being utilized. We saw power consumption go up to a pretty, eye-watering 160 to 180 watts. And the CPU benchmarking, we'll go into more detail later on this, when we saw 50% of the threads, so 16 threads, it went down to 170. When it went down even lower to 8 threads, it got 100 watts. And finally, when we're using just a single thread there, we saw 78 to 80 watts power consumption when that CPU was being pushed to its max. Now, in terms of GPU utilization, again, it's very hard to separate that from the CPU in a lot of testing, but utilizing the testing for ray tracing within 3DMark, we saw power consumption of around 162 to 172 watts. Again, depending on the game you choose to use and real-world utilization, that number could go up and down. Remember, it arrives at a 280 watt external PSU. When I was playing Sons of the Forest, again, it ain't no Cyberpunk, I know, but still, as a middle-of-the-road game, I went ahead with that with all of the settings set to max, that open-world survival game there, and I saw power consumption, I should say, of around 117 to 140 watts, and that was the game set to Ultra, but I was lowering the window capture there so we could still see the task manager at points. Really impressive overall, and again, for such a compact device there, respectable temps and heat and noise numbers throughout. And digging a little bit into those synthetic tools, for PCMark, we went for a maximum test. That's doing all of the office compliance, the video editing tools there, computer-aided design. We saw a score there in PCMark of 14,186 in terms of productivity, and in terms of digital content creation, 16,239. So again, very respectable numbers there. Switching over to 3D Mark once again with that CPU benchmark we saw earlier on. Alongside the power consumption, we also made a note of the scoring, and on that max thread test, we saw 12,980. In 16 threads, we saw 10,095. With 8 threads, 8,112. With 4 threads, 4,392 score. At just 2 threads, 2,379. And finally, with a single thread being utilised, we still saw I would argue, comparatively great number at 1,218. So in terms of just general CPU scoring, even the CPU sans the GPU, held respectable numbers there. That 14th gen Intel, hopefully Intel themselves have started getting really on top of any failures, but we'll have to wait and see. Ray tracing, using the Speedway test there, we saw an average of 32 to 34 frames per second all the way through, and an overall score at the end at 3,327. The gaming test there using Steel Nomad. That isn't the light one, this is the full fat version. Saw an average of 25.64 frames per second throughout the course of the 45-second test, and a score of 2,564. Finally, DirectX ray tracing came in at 41.66 frames per second all the way through. Of course, those are all synthetic numbers. We have to keep that in mind. Again, everyone's mileage will vary, but still nonetheless, I can't fault Minisforum in terms of the design and the output of this, but it is still effectively a very, very well-designed and compact laptop without a screen and a keyboard. And for many users, that design is going to be appealing. That design is going to be appealing rather than a larger scale desktop PC solution. It lacks a lot of the scalability, of course. It lacks a lot of the upgradability. And as mentioned, there's no way I'm going to use this as a NAS. But for those that are trying to find a sweet spot between modern console gaming and modern PC gaming, there are very few options in the market that are more desirable than this. That pricing is going to be a little bit off-putting for some, particularly its comparisons to laptop pricing, but I would argue towards buying each of the components individually for a desktop PC, fine-tuning it, getting the cooling in place. It's still going to be cheaper to go DIY, but not by a vast amount, and you kind of got to marvel at the design. But all of this will be for now if Minisforum don't support this product, if Minisforum don't maintain firmware BIOS updates and more. And lately, a lot of users have raised kind of concerns about Minisforum's commitment to products. And as we see more and more solutions come out the gate from this brand over shorter and shorter periods of time, some brands could get stretched a little thin. So hopefully this is a product that Minisforum will maintain. Ultimately, can't fault the design, I can't fault the overall, deployment of it and everything it's achieved in terms of power, thermals, capabilities for GPU, CPU, but there is a very specific kind of buyer for a solution like this. And although I'm not that buyer, if this sounds like something you would go for, let me know in the comments. But I just think most users, and that comparison to just buying a laptop, it's just going to be a little tough to compete with. But let me know what you guys think. If you want to support what we do and you are interested in getting hold of this or any other Minisforum product, and you do plan on going to the stores linked below, make sure those 3 things are true. Please use the links in the description to get hold of this device or anything else, because it allows us here at NAScompares to keep doing what we do, because we get a small commission on anything you buy. It allows you to silently and at no additional cost support creators like us. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.